Hello and welcome to Live Full, Retire Early, the podcast where we build calm wealth, intentional freedom and lives that don't need escaping from. We have real conversations with real people, just like you. So if this sounds like your thing, keep on listening. I'm Emma Woodhouse, your host. So a month ago, I hit publish. No huge audience, no plan that was fully formed or that I trusted, and definitely no certainty that anyone would read or listen. I just made a quiet decision to just go for it. Today, I'm taking you behind the scenes of my first monthly review and audit. Normally, this stuff stays private, but I think it's far more useful if I show you how this actually looks in real time. Because what we're building here isn't quick. It's something that compounds over time. And if you're building something too, feel free to use this as a framework for your own review. I will refine the way I do this as the months go on, but let's use this as a starting point. But before we get into this properly, I want to talk about something that sits behind this whole episode. At the start of every month, I block out time in my calendar for what I call a kind of CFO day, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's stepping out of the day-to-day and actually looking at what's going on. I review my personal and professional goals and figure out what's actually working, what's not, what should I be doing more of, and what should I stop doing. Because I've noticed, not just in myself, but with my clients as well, is that most people spend all of their time working in their business and almost no time working on it. And working on it is just as important, if not more. Don't get me wrong, the clients are busy, they're showing up, and they're doing the work. But without doing a monthly review and audit, you just keep moving without direction. And this is where something like the 80-20 rule really becomes important. Because usually, a small percentage of what we're doing is driving the majority of our results. And the rest is just noise, or a habit, or something we've never really questioned. But if you don't stop and look, you don't see it. So for me, this monthly review is dedicated CFO time. It's less about tracking everything perfectly and more about creating space to think properly, to zoom out, to notice patterns, and to make small adjustments. Because that's how things actually improve. Not through these massive changes, but through small, consistent course corrections. And that's exactly what this episode is about. So grab a cup of tea and let's dive in. The hardest thing wasn't writing or even publishing the podcast, although I thought it would be. But it was the imposter syndrome. Press and publish for the first time felt uncomfortable, because that's when the thoughts start creeping in. What if no one's interested? What if no one listens? Will people find my voice annoying? Do I need to sound more professional? Am I even ready to do this? Because when there's no response, your mind fills in the gaps. And usually it fills in with doubt. You start questioning everything. The way you sound, what you're saying, how you say it, and whether it's even good enough to be out there. But the truth is, nothing has actually gone wrong. And at the beginning, there's no momentum, there's no feedback loop, and there's no external validation telling you to keep on going. It's just you showing up anyway. And that's the part no one really talks about, because the silence can be deafening. And that's where most people stop. Not because they're not capable, because it doesn't feel like it's working yet. So if you're in that phase right now, where it feels quiet, where it feels uncertain, where it feels like you're putting things out and nothing's coming back yet, I've got to say, keep on going. Because this is the phase where most people quit. And it's also the phase that decides whether this ever compounds. So what actually happened in month one? In the first month, I didn't just start. I went for it. I made the decision to start podcasting with no pressure or expectations. Like I said in my second podcast episode, most of the content wasn't going to be scripted. It was originally going to be a stream of consciousness. However, I soon realised that I'm the kind of person that needs a rough outline at least. I then decided I would release some form of long-form content 1 to 2 times a week, and to create free downloads to help listeners and readers so that everyone listening and reading would actually use what I was talking about and not just listen and forget. As you know, I launched the podcast in March and I published 6 episodes, one of which went viral. Well, viral for me anyway. I received 85% of the downloads in March just for that one episode, which is insane. And that one episode, which was the work optional, the financial freedom people actually want, which I'll link in the show notes or description, depending on wherever you're listening to this. I also refined my audio because, as you will be able to tell, the first few episodes, the audio quality wasn't great. It wasn't something I was happy putting out there. I'm only 8 podcast episodes in, and I've already experimented with 4 different microphones. The one I'm using now, I think I'm happy with for the time being. So let me know in the comments what you think. And to be honest, the biggest constraint of this month has been time and learning new skills. I've been recording, editing and refining the process, which I know is completely normal at this stage. I've taught myself to edit, although editing wasn't in my original plan, because I wanted to make the process as seamless as possible, but I did notice that I stumble on too many words, and that wasn't how I wanted to show up for you. I wrote 4 articles and created practical resources designed to be used and not just read and forgotten. I showed up daily on Substack. I started conversations and I connected with people I wouldn't have otherwise met. And somewhere in all of that, it turned into an opportunity. I attracted a new client who has since offered to become a case study. He is a professional trader looking to refine and structure his approach further. He wants to stay anonymous, but doesn't mind me sharing some of the details from our conversations. And at the time, I wasn't chasing new clients. My main focus was to grow the business through the podcast and through writing on Substack. However, I am now open to taking on new clients. So what did I learn? Something became very clear to me very quickly. I noticed I was genuinely interested in weaving storytelling into my content. The week before I hit publish, I kept asking myself, who do I want to be? How do I want to show up? And all them kind of questions were just buzzing around my head for days. And the one phrase that kept coming up, it was like a silent whisper that got louder and louder. And that was to share, don't preach. And that has become the filter for everything. I'm not just teaching. I'm not just sharing frameworks, but using real experiences, reflections and conversations that people actually see themselves in. Because yes, information is useful, but stories are what people remember. But something far more valuable happened. I showed up and published consistently, and I started finding my voice. I began building something that actually feels like it's mine. And slowly, people started to find it. And that has been probably the best part of the month. So let's talk about Substack and the shift I didn't expect. If you're listening to this somewhere other than on Substack, because I also publish the content on there as well as the other usual podcasting platforms, I'd recommend heading over there because it's a great place to start. It's a live full, retire early, one place for everything place. Well, I thought Substack was just going to be another social media platform. But boy, was I wrong. And you know something? It was a pleasant and welcome surprise. Because what I didn't expect was how it feels. Because there's something slower about it and more intentional. People don't just scroll, flicking through the phones, but they read, they think, and then they reply. And they engage, and that's what people on there are actually looking for. And that approach changes how you write, because you stop chasing attention and you start building connections. And I'll be honest, that surprised me too, because in a world dominated by short-form content, there's still a place on the internet for long-form thinking to thrive. Because I'm not great with the whole short-form TikTok world. It's not for me. It's just too chaotic. The thought of it gives me a headache and it makes me need to lay down. But there was something else that I didn't expect on Substack, and that was the people. Because we're so used to the internet being full of noise, people arguing and shouting at each other, trying to be right and looking for a reaction. But that hasn't been my experience there. Well, I have had one negative interaction, and to be honest, it just felt like this person was looking for an argument for the sake of it, and I didn't engage. But everything else, I had genuine conversations, thoughtful replies, and people actually engaging with ideas. And that changes everything, because you don't feel like you're performing. You feel like you're building something with real people. Now let's talk about the podcast, because this didn't start as some big strategy. I've wanted to create one since Live Full, Retire Early was founded in 2019. But like most people, I had my reasons, or excuses. Some were valid, but mostly wasn't. And I can't believe it's taken me 6 whole years to finally press publish. Live Full, Retire Early originally started as a personal blog. And over the years, it's evolved into something so much bigger. And what I've realised is I don't just want to teach, I want to tell stories. Because information is everywhere. But the things that actually stay with you, they usually come from something real. So let's talk about everything I've built in month 1. If you want to explore what I've created in the last month, here it is, all in one place. The podcast. I published 7 episodes. The first episode was like a personal story. Audio, not great. I'm aware of that. I use the headset that I use on my computer. But that was the episode on the day I realised I was done being an employee, and where I share a personal experience that smacked me in the face. By the way, all the things I'm going to mention in this section will be linked in the show notes, in the description, wherever you're listening. I'm going to link it somewhere. Episode 2, Work Optional, the financial freedom most people actually want. Which, interestingly, this is the one that went viral, but I'll come back to that in a second. Episode 3 was how to invest in potential instead of chasing the finished product. And that episode was inspired by the 𝗂𝗍𝘃𝗶𝗄 Manosphere documentary. Episode 4, what's your financial freedom number and why most people don't know it. Episode 5 was like a bonus mini episode that week, and that was about the financial freedom formula. Episode 6 was the 5 money leaks quietly destroying your cash flow. And I notice every time I say that title, I go quietly. But you get the gist. Then I published 4 articles on Substack, which I'll link in the show notes or description. The articles were, Beginnings are hard, but drifting is harder. That was like my introduction post onto Substack. It was to get me over the hurdle of publishing something. It was a very good article, however, it's not my best article, I will admit. Article 2 was how I became unemployable after redundancy and what I'm building instead. I'm going to turn this into a podcast episode where I'm going to go a little deeper over the next few months, where I'm going to share more about my story, because when I published that, the podcast wasn't the plan. Article 3, what does financial freedom actually look like? That was like the companion post to the podcast episode. The Article 4 was about a Sunday reset that I do, like a weekly thing, kind of like what I do here, but a mini version. Then, as well as them 4 articles, there was additional companion posts that go alongside each podcast episode. I also created 2 downloadable resources. The first one was the Financial Freedom Number worksheet. The second one was the Money Leaks Audit worksheet, both of which I'll link in the show notes and description. On the podcast side, the strongest episode by a margin was the Work Optional, the Financial Freedom Most People Actually Want episode. And what's interesting about that episode is that it accounted for 85% of the total downloads. 85%. So what that tells me straight away is that idea landed. It's simple, it's direct, and it speaks to something people can immediately see in themselves. Because on the other end, the lowest performing episode was how to invest in potential instead of chasing the finished product, which that was the episode inspired by the 𝗂𝗶𝘃𝗵 documentary. And that accounted for less than 3% of the downloads, which tells me pretty clearly that that topic didn't land the same. I still think it's a really strong idea, but I think it's a bit more abstract, slightly more conceptual. So comparing the two, the clearer and more grounded the idea, the better it performs. Not because it is quote unquote better, but because people can instantly recognise themselves in it. So going forward, I'm going to anchor everything back to real life situations people can actually see themselves in. But that doesn't mean I'm going to stop sharing bigger, more conceptual ideas, because some of those are still worth exploring. So for month 2, I do actually have a plan, but it's not complicated. I'm going to keep publishing the podcast and writing on Substack because that's the foundation. That doesn't change. But the next thing I'm focusing on is YouTube. I'm going to start publishing the podcast on there as well, because when I launched the podcast, for whatever reason, because I publish through Substack, I couldn't link my Substack to my YouTube. However, I pressed the button today and it's working. So that's going to be my primary focus, is just doing that, getting that bit right. And alongside that, I'm going to aim for publishing 2 videos on YouTube as well. It's going to be nothing overproduced. Well, I said that about the podcast in month 1. But yeah, it's not going to be overproduced. It's not going to be perfect. I just want to get additional content out there in other formats. Because the way I see it, it's the same idea, it's the same message, just reaching people in different places. And that's really the focus for month 2. And just as important, I'm not trying to do everything. I'm not jumping onto every platform. I'm keeping this focused. I'm not reinventing anything. I'm just expanding what's already being built and making it easier to find. And something else I want to be more intentional with in month 2 is actually switching off. Because one thing I'm also paying attention to is my energy. What's actually sustainable and what isn't. Because there's no point me building something that's going to burn me out. As you know, I've been on it lately. I've been building, creating, figuring things out. And I'll admit my sleep has definitely taken a bit of a hit. Even my Garmin has been kicking off and telling me my body battery isn't where it should be. So creating more balance in my life, work and life, is something I want to focus on in the month of April as well. And that is also something I'll be sharing and experimenting with on YouTube. Because I think a lot of us are trying to spin a lot of plates at once. And I think probably the biggest thing I've realised this month, it isn't about doing everything perfectly. It's been about showing up and getting a little bit better each time. I wrote about this in my weekly reflections article on Substack, and it's something I call the 1% course correction. And it's exactly how I'm approaching this. Now let's look into the growth. I am going to share the numbers, but I'm mainly going to focus on the percentages because that is what actually matters. The starting point matters far less than the direction. Because when you're starting from 0, small numbers can still represent meaningful progress. And that's what I'm focused on. Not chasing big spikes, but building something that compounds over time. Because early on, percentage growth tells you far more than raw numbers ever will. And right now, at the beginning of month 1, I was starting at 0. Other than Instagram and on Facebook, I was already established there. So I'm not treating this as hard data yet. It's far too early for that. But what I'm looking at instead is simple. Are things moving in the right direction? So let's dive into the growth report. Because this is where I break down what's actually happening behind the scenes, what's working, what's not, and what I'm adjusting. And every month I'll break it down into 3 things. Attention, which is, are people finding the content? Conversion, are they choosing to stay? And engagement, do they actually care enough to respond? So let's start with attention. In the month of March, the podcast received 2,002 downloads, which tells me people are actually finding the content. On the conversion side, my subscribers on Substack were up 1,133%, and the followers were up by a massive 4,800%. So people aren't just listening, they're actually choosing to stay. And then engagement. I've had far more replies, conversations and messages than I ever expected. And I even attracted a new client, which honestly matters more than anything else right now. So upon reviewing everything that we've discussed, the episode that performed best had a much clearer and more direct hook. The one that didn't do as well was a bit more vague. So that tells me what to adjust. So next month I'm going to double down on clarity, with stronger titles, stronger positioning and no overthinking. Because I'm not trying to build this through spikes. I'm trying to build something that compounds. And right now, the only question that matters is, are we moving in the right direction? I think the biggest thing I realised this month, it isn't about doing everything perfectly. It was about showing up, and it was about getting a little bit better each time. And I wrote about this in the Weekly Reflections article on Substack, on something I call the 1% course correction. And that's exactly how I'm going to approach April. Because it would be very easy to look at the numbers and overcorrect. Second guess everything and start chasing what worked. But that is not the move I'm going to make. The move is small, intentional adjustments. And there's a simple way to think about it. Imagine a ship leaving a port, heading towards a Pacific destination. If the captain adjusts the course by just 1%, you wouldn't notice it at first. It would still look like you're going in the same direction. But over time, that small adjustment compounds. Days later or weeks later, that ship ends up somewhere completely different, and that's exactly how I'm treating this. Not one big shift, not a complete overhaul, just small course corrections based on what's actually working. Because building a work optional life and building this works in exactly the same way, and not in one big dramatic decision. Because if I look back onto when I started, it didn't look up to much. It felt quiet. It felt slow. It feels like nothing really happened. But something did happen. And what I'm seeing, even in this first month, well, it's a bit like a rocket taking off. At the beginning, it uses the most energy, the most fuel, and there's a lot more resistance. And for a while, it doesn't even look like it's working, like it's even moving. But what it's actually doing, it's breaking through gravity. And once it does that, everything changes. It doesn't need the same level of effort to keep moving because it's already in motion. And building something is exactly the same. In the early phases, it feels heavy. Because it is. You're creating something from nothing. You're building consistently. And you're finding what works. And the results don't always reflect that straight away, which is why this part matters. Because most people don't stop because they're not capable. They stop because they think the silence means it's not working. But it's not failure. It's just the phase where you're still breaking through. And that's why I'm focused more on direction than noise. Making small adjustments and not big reactions. Because this only works if you give it time to compound. And that's really the main focus for me right now. Not doing more, not reacting to every number, just making them small, intentional adjustments and letting them build over time. If you enjoyed this episode, it would really mean a lot if you took 30 seconds to follow the show and leave a quick review. It's what helps more people discover this and start building their own work optional life. You'll find everything else, including deeper dives and practical tools, over on my Substack, which is linked in the show notes. And as always, strategy beats stress, systems beat willpower, and your future is built on what you do consistently and not occasionally. Until next time.